Here's what happened when Jean-Claude Van Damme challenged Steven Seagal. The room went quiet the moment Jean-Claude Van Damme spoke those words. It was supposed to be a glamorous industry event. Flashing cameras, famous faces, confident smiles. Two legends under one roof. People expected polite greetings, maybe a handshake, maybe nothing at all. What they didn't expect was a challenge. Jean-Claude Van Damme stood tall, muscles tight beneath his tailored jacket, the same confidence that made him a global action icon burning in his eyes. He smiled, but it wasn't friendly. It was the kind of smile that dares you to respond. Across the room stood Steven Seagal. No crowd around him. No flashy moves. No attempt to impress anyone. He leaned casually, arms relaxed, expression calm, almost bored. The kind of calm that doesn't come from confidence, but from certainty. Jean-Claude's voice cut through the air. So this is the man everyone says is untouchable? A few nervous laughs echoed. Phones slowly came out. People sensed something was about to happen. Steven didn't answer. That silence hit harder than any insult. Jean-Claude took a step forward. All these years, he continued, louder now, people keep asking who's better. Who's real? Who could actually fight? The crowd froze. This wasn't scripted. This wasn't for the cameras. Steven finally lifted his eyes. No anger. No ego. Just focus. Jean-Claude smirked. Why don't we settle it? At that moment, the air changed. Conversations stopped. Even security stiffened. Two legends. One challenge. Everyone waiting for the explosion. Steven slowly straightened up. People leaned in, expecting words, maybe even a shove. Instead, Steven said nothing. He simply looked at Jean-Claude, not with hatred, not with fear, but with something far more unsettling. Understanding. That's when some in the room felt it. The shift. The realization that this wasn't a movie scene. This wasn't about fame or muscles or headlines. This was about something deeper. Jean-Claude's smile flickered for just a fraction of a second. No one noticed, except Steven. And in that silent moment, before a single punch was thrown, before a single word was spoken, the real battle had already begun. Because when true power is tested, it doesn't rush. It waits. The challenge escalates. The silence after Steven Seagal's stare felt heavier than any shouted insult. People shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether they were witnessing the beginning of history or the beginning of disaster. Jean-Claude Van Damme broke the tension first. He laughed, loud, sharp, performative. The kind of laugh meant to dominate a room. Come on, he said, spreading his arms slightly, letting the crowd see the confidence that had carried him through decades of fame. Don't tell me the legendary Steven Seagal doesn't even want to talk. A few people chuckled nervously. Cameras zoomed in. This was turning into something no PR team could control. Steven remained still. Up close, people began to notice details they hadn't before. He wasn't stiff. He wasn't tense. His breathing was slow, steady, the way a man breathes when he's not preparing to fight, but when he knows he doesn't have to. Jean-Claude took another step forward, invading his space just enough to send a message. You know, he continued, lowering his voice, I've been doing this my whole life. Real training. Real fights. Real discipline. And yet somehow, your name always comes up. That last line wasn't accidental. It was bait. Around them, industry executives pretended not to stare. Bodyguards subtly repositioned themselves. A few veteran stunt coordinators exchanged worried looks. They knew egos. They knew how quickly moments like this could spiral. Steven finally spoke. His voice was calm. Almost soft. Why does it matter? The question caught Jean-Claude off guard. What? He replied. Why does it matter who's better? Steven asked again, his tone steady. To you. The room leaned in. Jean-Claude paused, then smiled again, wider this time. Because people talk, he said. Because legends are measured. Because when two fighters stand in the same room, someone always wants to know who walks out on top. Steven nodded slowly, as if considering the words. For a moment, It seemed like the tension might dissolve. But Jean-Claude wasn't finished. "You play tough in movies," he said, his voice sharpening. "But off-camera, people say different things." A collective inhale swept the room. That line crossed it, the invisible boundary between curiosity and provocation. Steven didn't flinch. He took a small step forward, closing the distance, not aggressively, not suddenly. Deliberately. The kind of movement that doesn't challenge. It controls. "Movies are stories," Steven said quietly. "Life is practice." Jean-Claude's jaw tightened. Around them, whispers began. Names were mentioned. Old rumors. Old interviews. Stories from sets. Stories from dojos. Some exaggerated. Some not. An older producer near the back leaned toward a colleague and whispered, "You know Seagal trained with people who didn't perform for cameras." Another voice murmured, "Yeah, and he doesn't posture." Jean-Claude heard none of it, or maybe he chose not to. "You're saying you're above it," he scoffed. "Above proving yourself?" Steven held his gaze. "No," he replied. "I'm saying I already did." That was the moment the atmosphere truly changed. This wasn't trash talk. This wasn't bravado. It was a statement, plain, grounded, unadorned. Jean-Claude shifted his weight. Just slightly. Fighters noticed it. So did Steven. Confidence is loud. Experience is quiet. Jean-Claude straightened, clearly unwilling to back down in front of an audience. "So what happens now?" he asked. "We just walk away?" Steven looked around the room, at the cameras, the executives, the young actors watching with wide eyes. Then he looked back at Jean-Claude. "What happens now," he said calmly, "depends on whether this is about ego or respect." The word hung in the air like a challenge of its own. For the first time, Jean-Claude didn't immediately respond. Because somewhere deep beneath the fame, the spotlight, and the pride, he felt it. This wasn't a man he could intimidate. And whatever happened next, whether it ended in confrontation or understanding, would change how everyone in that room saw strength. When ego demands an answer. The word respect still hung in the air when Jean-Claude Van Damme finally moved again. Not forward this time, sideways. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone who wasn't trained. A shift of stance. A change in balance. Fighters noticed immediately. So did Steven Seagal. Jean-Claude smiled, but this smile was different. Tighter. Controlled. "Respect," he repeated slowly. Funny word. Everyone uses it. Few earn it. A few people nodded. Others grew uneasy. This wasn't playful anymore. This was two men measuring each other without throwing a single punch. Jean-Claude gestured casually toward the open space near the center of the room. "We don't need a stage," he said. "Just a few seconds. That's all it would take." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Security tensed. An assistant director whispered urgently into a phone. Someone near the back quietly began recording. Steven didn't look at the space. He looked at Jean-Claude. "You're asking for something you don't actually want," Steven said. Jean-Claude laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You don't get to decide what I want." Steven nodded once. "That's true. But I can recognize it." Jean-Claude's jaw tightened again. His pride was fully engaged now. Backing down would mean humiliation. Pushing forward meant risk. "People say a lot of things about you," Jean-Claude said. "They say you're dangerous. They say you don't play by the rules." Steven tilted his head slightly. "Rules are agreements," he replied. "Not guarantees." That line hit harder than it sounded. An old fight coordinator stepped closer to another and whispered, "This isn't good." Jean-Claude stepped into the open space. That was the moment the crowd split. Some leaned forward, hungry for chaos. Others stepped back, sensing something they didn't want to be part of. A few executives looked pale, careers and contracts flashing through their minds. Jean-Claude raised his hands just enough to be unmistakable. "Not attacking. Inviting. Just show them," he said. "Show them what's real." Steven exhaled slowly. He glanced at the floor, not in submission, but in thought. Then he looked back up. "This isn't the place," he said. Jean-Claude scoffed. "There's always an excuse." Steven stepped forward. Not into the space, but close enough that only Jean-Claude could hear him. "You're standing in front of witnesses," Steven said quietly. "If you force this, someone gets hurt. And it won't be a story you like telling." Jean-Claude's eyes flicked, just for a moment, toward Steven's hands. They weren't clenched. They weren't shaking. They weren't preparing. They were relaxed. That disturbed him more than any fighting stance ever could. "Is that a threat?" Jean-Claude asked, though his voice had dropped. "No," Steven answered. "It's a courtesy." The room felt smaller now. Tighter. Like the walls were listening. Jean-Claude straightened, suddenly aware of how many eyes were on him. Of how many people were waiting to see if he'd push this past the point of no return. Someone near the front spoke without realizing it. "This is getting real." Jean-Claude turned back to Steven. "You think you're above everyone here," he said. Steven shook his head slowly. "No. I think I'm responsible for myself." That answer landed in an unexpected place. Jean-Claude opened his mouth, then stopped. For the first time since the challenge began, he hesitated. Because deep down, beneath the pride and the spotlight, he understood something uncomfortable. This wasn't a man playing a role. This was a man who had nothing to prove, and nothing to gain from winning. Jean-Claude lowered his hands slightly. Not surrender. But not escalation either. The crowd held its breath. This was the edge, the exact point where ego either explodes or breaks. And in that suspended moment, when no one spoke and no one moved, a third voice cut through the silence. "Enough." Heads turned. What happened next would change everything. When silence speaks louder than strength. The single word, "enough," sliced through the tension like a blade. Every head in the room turned at once. A man stepped forward from near the entrance. He wasn't dressed for attention. No flashy suit. No camera crew following him. Just a quiet presence with authority written in the way people instinctively made space as he walked. Those who recognized him felt a chill. He was a senior coordinator, someone who had worked behind the scenes for decades. Someone who had seen real fighters. Real injuries. Real consequences. When he spoke, it wasn't for drama. It was to stop things before they went too far. "This isn't a stage," the man said firmly. "And this isn't a movie." The room exhaled, though no one realized they'd been holding their breath. Jean-Claude Van Damme turned toward him, irritation flashing across his face. "Stay out of it," he snapped. "This is between us." The coordinator didn't flinch. "That's exactly why I'm stepping in." He looked at Jean-Claude first. "You're a legend. Everyone here knows that. You've earned your place." Then he turned to Steven Seagal. "And so has he." The words landed with unexpected weight. Whispers spread instantly. Jean-Claude frowned. "So what? We just pretend this didn't happen." Steven said nothing. The coordinator continued, his voice calm but unyielding. "You want to know why he doesn't posture? Why he doesn't argue? Why he doesn't rise to bait?" He paused. "Because he's been in rooms where no one clapped." That line sent a ripple through the crowd. A few older faces exchanged looks. They understood exactly what that meant. Jean-Claude crossed his arms. "Everyone's been through something." "Yes," the coordinator agreed. "But not everyone learns when to stop." Steven finally spoke. "You don't need to explain," he said quietly. The coordinator nodded, then turned back to Jean-Claude. "I've seen men get hurt trying to prove something that didn't need proving. And I won't watch it happen again." Jean-Claude laughed, but the sound lacked confidence. "So what are you saying? That he's untouchable?" "No," the coordinator replied. "I'm saying he's disciplined." That word hit differently. Discipline wasn't flashy. It wasn't loud. It didn't feed ego. It restrained it. Jean-Claude looked back at Steven, searching for something: anger, arrogance, challenge. He found none. Steven met his gaze steadily. Not aggressively. Not dismissively. Just present. "I didn't come here to compete," Steven said. "I came here to be." The simplicity of it unsettled the room. Jean-Claude scoffed, but his voice faltered. "So you expect me to just walk away?" Steven nodded once. "Not for me," he said. "For yourself." That struck something deeper than Jean-Claude wanted to admit. Around them, the crowd began to shift, not physically, but emotionally. The excitement that had once buzzed now felt inappropriate. Almost embarrassing. A younger actor whispered to his friend, "This isn't what strength looks like in movies." His friend replied quietly, "Yeah, it's scarier." Jean-Claude glanced around and realized the energy had turned. People weren't waiting for him to win anymore. They were waiting to see if he could stop. He inhaled slowly. Then, with visible effort, he dropped his arms completely. Not in defeat. In control. The coordinator stepped back, satisfied. "Good," he said. "Because this ends here." Steven gave a small nod of acknowledgement. Jean-Claude hesitated, then muttered, "You're different than I expected." Steven's lips curved into the faintest smile. "So are you." The tension didn't explode. It dissolved. But something had shifted, something permanent. Because everyone in that room had just witnessed a truth they wouldn't forget. Real power doesn't need permission. And real strength doesn't need an audience. When ego steps aside and truth steps forward, the room didn't erupt into applause. It didn't explode into chaos either. Instead, something far more unusual happened. People began to breathe again. Conversations restarted in hushed tones. Phones lowered. Security eased their posture. The moment that had threatened to spiral into legend-ending disaster quietly folded in on itself. Jean-Claude Van Damme stepped back first. Not dramatically. Not angrily. Just one step, but it was enough to signal the end. Steven Seagal didn't move at all. That contrast didn't go unnoticed. The coordinator gave one final look to both men, then turned and walked away, his job done. The invisible line had been redrawn, and everyone felt it. Jean-Claude adjusted his jacket, suddenly aware of how exposed he felt. Without the tension, without the challenge, the spotlight felt harsher. He glanced around and realized something uncomfortable. No one was cheering him on. They were watching him. Steven broke the silence, not loudly, not for the room, just enough. "You okay?" he asked. The question landed unexpectedly. Jean-Claude blinked. "You asking me?" Steven nodded. "Yeah." There was no sarcasm in his voice. No superiority. Just a simple check-in. Jean-Claude exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. "You know how it is," he said. "People keep pushing. Comparing. Asking." Steven shrugged slightly. "That never stops." They stood there, two men surrounded by a crowd, yet strangely alone in the moment. Jean-Claude studied Steven's face, not as a rival now, but as a man. "You really weren't going to fight," he said. Steven met his eyes. "Not here. Not like that. Not for this." "For what?" Jean-Claude asked. "For ego," Steven replied. "It's expensive." That line hit harder than anything else that night. Jean-Claude looked down, then laughed quietly, not mockingly, but with a hint of realization. "You know," he said, "I thought silence was weakness." Steven shook his head. "Silence is where you hear yourself clearly." Nearby, a few industry veterans watched the exchange closely. One of them whispered, "This is bigger than a fight." Another nodded. "This is maturity." Jean-Claude glanced at the people watching and then back at Steven. "They'll talk about this," he said. Steven smiled faintly. "They always do." "But they won't know what really happened," Jean-Claude added. Steven's smile faded just enough to feel honest. "That's fine." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Jean-Claude did something no one expected. He extended his hand. The room froze again, but this time it wasn't fear. It was anticipation of something better. Steven looked at the hand, then took it. The handshake wasn't firm for show. It wasn't performative. It was brief. Respectful. Real. Cameras clicked, but the moment felt oddly private. Jean-Claude leaned in slightly and said, quietly, "You could have embarrassed me." Steven replied just as softly, "You didn't need help." Jean-Claude let out a short breath, half laugh, half acceptance. Around them, the atmosphere had completely transformed. What had once felt like a looming disaster now felt like a lesson unfolding in real time. A young stunt performer whispered to another, "That's how legends act." An older actor nodded. "That's how careers last." Jean-Claude stepped back and straightened. "I misjudged you," he said openly now. Steven inclined his head. "We all do sometimes." There was no winner declared. Because there didn't need to be one. What mattered was what didn't happen. No punches, no headlines about violence, no careers derailed by pride. As people began to drift away, conversations buzzed with a different energy now. Not excitement, but reflection. Jean-Claude paused before leaving, turning back one last time. "Next time," he said, "we talk without an audience." Steven nodded. "That would be better." Jean-Claude walked off, shoulders lighter than before. Steven remained where he was for a moment longer, watching the room reset itself. The storm had passed. And without a single strike thrown, the balance had shifted forever. What real victory looks like. The crowd thinned slowly, as if people were reluctant to leave the afterglow of what they'd just witnessed. There were no bruises to point at, no dramatic footage of fists flying, yet everyone felt like they'd seen something rare. Steven Seagal stepped away from the center of the room and moved toward a quieter corner. The noise faded behind him. For the first time that night, he allowed himself a slow breath. Moments later, Jean-Claude Van Damme reappeared. Not with an entourage. Not with cameras. Alone. He approached cautiously, like a man who wasn't sure if he was welcome, a stark contrast to the confidence he displayed earlier. "Got a minute?" Jean-Claude asked. Steven looked up and nodded. "Sure." They stood side by side, facing away from the room, watching people come and go. The distance between them wasn't charged anymore. It was neutral. Honest. "I need to say something," Jean-Claude began. "And I need to say it without an audience." Steven waited. "I let my pride drive that moment," Jean-Claude admitted. Years of comparisons, interviews, fans asking the same question over and over, it got to me. Steven nodded slowly. "It happens." Jean-Claude frowned. "That's it. No lecture." Steven smiled faintly. "You already gave yourself one." Jean-Claude let out a quiet laugh. "Fair." He shifted his weight. "You know, when you didn't react, that bothered me more than anything. I kept thinking, why isn't he playing along?" Steven's expression turned thoughtful. "Because once you play that game," he said, "you're stuck in it forever." Jean-Claude absorbed that in silence. "I spent years proving myself," Jean-Claude said finally. "Fighting. Performing. Pushing. And somewhere along the way, I forgot when to stop." Steven turned to him. "Stopping isn't quitting," he said. "It's choosing." That distinction landed deep. Jean-Claude looked down at his hands. "I thought strength was about dominance," he admitted. "About standing tallest in the room." Steven shook his head. "Strength is about knowing when you don't need to stand at all." They stood quietly for a few moments, the weight of decades of competition, fame, and expectation settling into something calmer. Nearby, the coordinator passed by again, glancing at them with a knowing look. He didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. Jean-Claude broke the silence. "If this had gone the other way, if I'd pushed harder." Steven finished the thought gently. "Someone would have gotten hurt. And it wouldn't have proved anything," Jean-Claude added. "No," Steven agreed. "It rarely does." Jean-Claude nodded slowly. "You protected me tonight." Steven met his eyes. "I protected both of us." That truth was impossible to ignore. As the event staff began clearing the room, Jean-Claude extended his hand again, not for show this time. "Thank you," he said. Steven shook it. "You're welcome." There was no need for more words. Jean-Claude paused, then smiled, a genuine one this time. "Next time someone asks who's better," he said, "I'll tell them this story." Steven chuckled softly. Tell them whatever helps them sleep. Jean-Claude laughed, the tension finally gone. You know, he said, this might be the first time I've ever walked away from a challenge feeling stronger. Steven nodded. That's because you did. They parted ways shortly after, each disappearing into different exits, leaving behind a room that felt subtly changed. People would talk. Rumors would spread. Versions of the story would grow louder, wilder, less accurate. But those who had been there, those who had felt the shift, knew the truth. Victory didn't belong to fists that night. It belonged to restraint. It belonged to humility. It belonged to two men who chose wisdom over ego. And long after the event ended, one lesson lingered in the air like an echo. The strongest move is the one you never have to make. The lesson that lasts longer than applause. By the next morning, the story had already begun to change. Some people claimed there had almost been a fight. Others exaggerated the tension, turning silence into imagined moves and restraint into secret techniques. Headlines hinted at drama. Fans argued online, choosing sides, replaying rumors that fit their own beliefs. But none of that captured the truth. Because the real moment, the one that mattered, never made noise. Those who had been in the room remembered it differently. Not as a near brawl, but as a pause. A rare, deliberate pause where two men with every reason to clash chose something else instead. Steven Seagal returned to his routine without comment. No interviews. No statements. No need to control the narrative. His silence wasn't avoidance, it was consistency. He lived the same way he had acted that night, without chasing validation. Jean-Claude Van Damme, on the other hand, felt the moment linger. In quiet conversations later, with friends and colleagues, he spoke differently than before. Less about proving, more about understanding. When asked about rivalry, he smiled and changed the subject. When pressed, he said only this: some battles aren't meant to be won. They're meant to be recognized. That single sentence carried more growth than any headline ever could. What made the moment powerful wasn't who could strike faster or harder. It was who could stop. In a world that rewards reaction, Steven had chosen restraint. In a culture that celebrates dominance, Jean-Claude had chosen reflection. And that choice echoed far beyond the walls of that room. Young actors who witnessed the exchange carried it with them. One later admitted, "I thought strength was about taking control. That night taught me it's about knowing when you already have it." Veterans recognized it immediately. They'd seen too many careers rise on ego and fall the same way. They knew how rare it was to see pride disarmed without humiliation. The lesson was simple, but not easy. Respect isn't something you demand. It's something you demonstrate. You don't earn it by overpowering others. You earn it by mastering yourself. Steven never needed to explain his strength. He let it speak through stillness. Jean-Claude didn't lose anything that night. He gained perspective, and that's far harder to acquire. True power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't posture. It doesn't need witnesses. It shows up in how you respond when challenged, and whether you choose to escalate or elevate. That's why the moment still matters. Not because of who these men are, legends, icons, stars, but because of what they represented in that instant. Two paths stood open. One led to chaos, regret, and headlines that would fade. The other led to dignity, growth, and a lesson that would last. They chose the second. And that choice is available to all of us. Every time someone disrespects you. Every time your ego urges you to react. Every time you feel the pull to prove something to an audience that doesn't truly matter. You can strike. Or you can stand still. One creates noise. The other creates legacy. So here's the real question, not who would win in a fight, but who do you want to become when challenged? If you believe humility is strength, type respect in the comments. If you believe self-control is real power, type. And tell me, where are you watching from? Because voices that choose wisdom deserve to be heard.